Thank you so much. It's a great idea if you're ever worried about doing a talk to just, train up a bunch of students to do it really, really well, and then you just get to ride their coattails later. So this is building cyber threat resilience with STRAT. Dr. Johnson was nice enough to start previewing kind of what we were talking about. Midway through the talk, I'm like, please don't go too far into this. You're going to ruin our entire talk. She didn't. So we're going to talk through kind of what this methodology looks like in detail. So first of all, this is Chandler McClellan. He is a graduating senior at Utah State University, former president of our student organization for cybersecurity, data analytics student, kind of just running around doing everything in a way that makes me feel like I'm not all that busy.
Yes. And then by way of introduction, Scott Roberts. Well, that's kind of eloquent the way you put that together. I should have practiced how to introduce you. Scott's had, I don't know, 20 plus years, longer than I've been alive, industry experience. And he's a storied man. I think he got to the crossroads in life where he could either become a CISO or a professor. And don't let anyone say you're not a good person.
Who had the over-under on 2 minutes for an old joke? I had the under. So we are here by way of Utah State University. This picture was taken on my birthday on July 26th. No, not quite, but it does look that and that picturesque very often up in the Wasatch Range of northern Utah. Our primary association is we are both members of the Huntsman School, where I teach cybersecurity. It's Utah State's business school. And our data analytics and information systems department has a cybersecurity emphasis, where Chandler is a student. And then to make our lives extra complicated, we are also both members of the Center for Anticipatory Intelligence, where Chandler is working on the minor and I am a master's student. So I get to have the awkwardness of being both a teacher and a peer. And then one of my other jobs is I am also the advisor for the Student Organization for Cybersecurity. If you want a fun one, ask us where that logo came from. It's a pretty good one. So here's the problem as I see it. There are three things cyber threat intelligence is really good for. Situational awareness, briefing your leadership on what's going on, as a precursor to detection engineering, and marketing. How many of the great threat reports we've read put out by these vendors who are doing fantastic work are doing so primarily to just get eyeballs on? Correct. See, us having this back and forth means we're now getting audience participation.
This is good.
It's a fantastic thing, but I honestly believe there's more cyber threat intelligence can do. And one of the things I think we should be focused on is using cyber threat intelligence to help build resilience. Somebody was running around with stickers that said something like, Intel is not your job. And that's true. We are doing intelligence with the idea of building improved resilience for our organizations, for our country, for whoever your customer base happens to be. And I think cyber threat intelligence doesn't have nearly enough impact on trying to improve that resilience. And so we're going to share a way we think we can improve that. So what we're going to talk about, we are going to give a very brief introduction, piggybacking off of Dr. Johnson's keynote, on what systems thinking is. We are going to give an even quicker and shorter introduction into what resilience is. And then we are going to walk through this framework called STRAT to how do we turn intelligence into resilience. So what is systems thinking? Well, it's a structured approach for talking about complex interactions. I skipped over the slide on what are complicated problems versus complex problems. But the point is we have these very multifaceted, multidimensional problems, and they are hard for any one person to just completely keep in their head. And systems thinking is one way to put structure around these things to understand them. It's very closely related to a lot of things we already do. And in our case, the kind of what it ends up looking like is mapping attacker approaches to our defensive approaches. So why think in systems? Well, as Jeannie talked about, it helps you start to anticipate not just if I do this, I'll get that, the simplest approach, but start looking at what are the second and third order effects. If I change this, it's not just going to lead to one thing changing, it'll lead to multiple things changing. It also provides us a framework to start bringing in some of these more disparate parts of cybersecurity that we don't normally think about as intelligence. Bringing in things like risk modeling, starting to bring in architecture, and then, yes, cyber threat intelligence so that we can improve resilience. And last of all, the reason to think in systems is we already do. We think in networks all the time. We think in the interaction between multiple servers and how does it work when an email comes in this way and it gets pivoted over here. So the point being, you're already doing this. We just want to help build a little structure around it. So there's a couple different basic models we'll use. One of the basic ones is what you call stock and flow. So this is the idea of how does a process, how does a resource essentially move through a set of processes. So this is just the simplest example I could come up with. On the left on that cloud, we've got all of the water in the world, and it goes through a faucet, which you can turn on and off. And the result is the amount of water in a bathtub. Pretty straightforward. You open the drain, and some water is going to come out. Now, the difference between the faucet's openness and the drain's openness is going to determine, is your bath nicely balanced, or is your bath starting to overflow, or are you suddenly sitting there without any water and it's just awkward? But this is one of the ideas we think through to understand what's the interaction between a thing that we do and a stock of whatever it happens to be.
This is a causal loop diagram. It's another thing we use in the STRAT methodology to map complex systems like Jeannie alluded to earlier. There's so many moving components of it. This is not a very complex system, but this is to understand the idea of how causal loops are related to one another. So looking at eggs and chickens and the arrows that flow between them, there's little markers, positive and negative. That's not to connotate the relationship between the two of them, but rather how one influences the other. So the more eggs we have, obviously leads to more chickens. And the more chickens we have, the more eggs. So it's a reinforcing loop that builds in stimulus as the input is increased. However, on the other side of house, we have chickens and road crossings. And for our poor chicken, he's not very good at crossing the interstate and ends up biting it most of the time. So you can see that as the chickens increase, the road crossings are increased. However, going back to chickens, they are decreasing in nature. So you can start to map a diagram in a system like this to understand how related the components are.
And so we have to think about this in terms of if we're managing this particular system and we want there to be more chickens, then we need to focus on how do we help this chickens create more eggs. By the same token, if we want to protect our chickens, we need to start thinking about maybe we need a fence up next to the road so that we don't see that balancing loop continue. So it's a very simple way to understand what are the interactions between these differing components.
Resilience. So Jeannie alluded to this perfectly earlier. We're just going to briefly run through some of the definitions here to really set up a framework for why we do this methodology and how it applies. Resilience, high level, it's just really looking at that system and how resilient it is to a threat, how quickly it's able to recover and adapt. There's 4 R's that make up resilience. The first one is resistance. So really understanding the ability of the system to withstand that impact from a threat, whatever the threat is to the system and how it affects the different components. You look at how it can possibly propagate through the different components of the system and influence them.
And this one should make the most sense to everybody in here, because what are we talking about when we think about resistance components? Resistance components are putting up things like firewalls. They're putting out things like two-factor authentication. They're the really common defensive architectures we tend to put in place where the idea is let's keep the adversary from getting in to begin with. Let's block them at their initial ingress. So it can look like a lot of different things, but the idea is let's keep the system from transferring control to the adversary's perspective to begin with. And that's really the idea of resilience in our framework.
Retention, simply it's how well are we maintaining that core functionality after an impacted piece of the system, a different component is hit. With cybersecurity, we see this a lot, trying to mitigate the spread after we see a detection. How quickly can we shut down the threat, contain it, and go through that incident response process as quickly as possible. So retention is also a key impact of understanding the system and how we mitigate threat here.
So this is one of those things that when I first saw this methodology, and by the way, this was under my student side, not my professor side, I went, how have we not thought about this before? Because I will just say, we think about resilience all the time. It is something people in cybersecurity are constantly considering, and how do we improve and how do we raise it? But the idea of how do we keep a system going while it's being impacted by a threat, if you've ever been in a situation where you're dealing with a persistent APT group, who was able to just shut down the entire network for 4.5 weeks while you figured out what was going on? Yeah, I don't see any hands raising, and I wouldn't expect to. But we don't think about it in terms of how do we build a system that's able to continue to be usable and meet all of its functional goals under an attack. And so just this whole perspective of why are we not thinking about that aspect as well as how do we keep them out? It sometimes feels like as an industry, the second they get in, we just go, all right, I guess we're done. Now we're just an incident response. But I think this is a key thing, especially as we start seeing more and more sophisticated cyber attacks where I can say I've been part of some organizations where you just had to learn how to live with the idea of an adversary in your network operating pretty constantly. But we didn't build with the idea of making sure we could ensure that. So this to me was a real light bulb moment.
Recovery, simply put, is the ability of a system to recover some level of baseline operation in the wake of it. We often focus about, backups, what do we have in place, what processes do we have to kind of get back to operations as quickly as possible. It's pretty common in cybersecurity, pretty good practice if you look a lot at like data backups and common practices that most people employ throughout their businesses. It's all about understanding that at the end of the day, if something goes terribly wrong, we are not resetting from ground zero. We have something to build on, and we can quickly get back to completing our goal, our mission, our objective, whatever the focus of the stakeholders is in that context.
All right, I'm going to be a professor right now. Chandler, pop quiz.
I hate pop quizzes.
What cyber role would you say is most responsible for recovery?
All of them, or it depends. You have two options. I didn't go to all of your classes, but I got that one.
No, the correct answer is incident response. All right.
Dang it. Fine. Well, in order to resurge from this failure, resurgence is the final R of resilience that we understand in System Think. And this is really, how do we come back stronger after we've been breached? I mean, Scott famously he probably didn't say it first, but back in biblical times when they used to say there's two kind of companies out there, those that have been breached and those that don't know it yet, I strongly believe that resurgence is how we get to learning from those experiences, how we kind of grow in the aftermath of it.
And this one's no big deal because we all talk all the time about how after action reports and hot washes and things like that are critical after every single security incident. And everyone in here is doing these constantly, right? So, I mean, the idea of resurgence is quite literally that simple. It's the idea of, are we letting the lessons learned during an incident just fall by the wayside so we can get struck by the same thing over and over again? And at least in my experience, this was where I came into cyber threat intelligence. So this one made so much sense to me because when I started doing cyber threat intelligence, and I'll make the old joke now, thank you.
It's the third one.
We didn't have the idea of cyber threat intelligence. We were trying to call it meta incident response of why aren't we analyzing each of these incidents and making sure that there's something unique every time and we're not just falling prey to the same thing over and over again? And that's really the concept of resurgence. So how do we build resilience? Where does it come from? Well, there's a wide variety of possibilities that you have to apply judiciously. And this is where, and anybody who tells you otherwise, systems thinking is not a science, it's an art. And when Jeannie talked about putting up the diagrams, first of all, I just thought, oh my gosh, my causal loop diagrams always look terrible. But second of all, it's fair that there is an art to it. So redundancy. The DNS system has been remarkably redundant for has been remarkably resilient for an incredibly long time, largely due to redundancy. There's not just one root DNS server, there's 18 root DNS servers, and they are built to be redundant that way. Diversity is one I don't think we spend nearly enough time on. How many organizations have one dominant operating system? I would bet the vast majority. There's a really interesting Bruce Schneier where he talks about the idea that that's a problem. And we've become so homogeneous that it puts us at risk, very similar to how bird flu can go through a chicken population very, very quickly. Centralization and decentralization, again, this is one of those places where it depends how you're applying it. But you can see these different approaches. Now, towards the bottom, I think we have some important ones where they're non-technical. The idea of stakeholder engagement. How many times have you had an incident where you were trying to help an organization get through something and couldn't figure out the right person to get on the phone? Hadn't been through a tabletop exercise so people understood that when the cyber threat intelligence team delivers this package, it needs to go to the detection engineering team first, then it goes to the incident response team. Taking the time to understand what are our business processes that go along with our technical solutions is an incredibly strong part of how we build resilience into our organizations.
So STRAT methodology, we've put it off long enough. Let's dive into it, and that is understanding really what goes on here. This man, very important man to the folks here from the Center for Anticipatory Intelligence, is Dr. Jeffrey Taylor. He invented the System-Centric Threat and Resilience tool, or assessment tool, which we'll be going over today.
With Jeannie.
With Jeannie.
With Jeannie. And
I
Brianna.
missed that in the note.
And Brianna. It's on the slide.
And Brianna. Another pop quiz blown. All right, but it's an ongoing methodology that's continuing to be researched and implemented year after year with the students as they go through this. I know Scott has also done a lot of work with systems thinking and understanding this. So
this is a key part of one of our core classes in the Center for Anticipatory Intelligence, whether it's the minor or the master's. And interestingly, Chandler and I, both as cyber people, had to go through this methodology as part of the class. Now, interestingly, neither one of us picked a cyber problem. We, in fact, both picked the same problem 2 different years. Okay, there were cyber components to it. It's a complex problem. Yeah, okay. But looking at the air traffic control system. So we may reference that as we go through.
So,
no, you.
STRAT methodology. This is a super simple 7-step process that helps you go through, and at each step you're iterating on this idea and doing the work to further understand the system. As we've alluded to, these aren't just a complicated problem set. They're often complex or wicked in nature with a lot of interdependencies and a lot of external factors as well as internal factors in the system. We're trying to get the understanding of the system from the 1-inch view as well as the 5,000-foot view. So you go through each of these steps, identifying a system, understanding the threats to that system, and investigating those, trying to understand how they impact the system's resilience in order to ultimately provide good recommendations, know how to improve the system, control for the outcome and the desire that you want within it.
So the first step, you have to know what on earth your system is. Much in the same way that you can't really kick off an intelligence process without having a good sense of, what's your direction. You have to do the same thing for STRAT. So, we think about systems in terms of, where are systems that are highly complex? Doesn't make sense to put a lot of this towards something that's relatively simple. That's not the kind of problem STRAT's built for. We're looking at systems that have potential vulnerabilities and critical assets. Things where if something goes wrong, there's going to be a large impact. I think we all know that playing to your audience is important. So sometimes you're picking a system simply based on audience need and who are your stakeholders and what are they desiring to understand at a deeper level. And that one I want to call out specifically because it often speaks to, and I think I'm going to have some people with me on this. We all have leadership that thinks certain things in our organization are simple, that we know are not particularly simple. And making mistakes about that is one of the things that leads to vulnerabilities. Anybody who's dealt with a supply chain attack understands, hey, it's simple. You just look for if the log4j library is included in this piece of software, right? Oh no, it was 26 dependencies down is where the log4j library was included, but my entire app is now vulnerable. That's the kind of thing that these systems level approaches help you understand. And then lastly, I would say STRAT is particularly useful for things that have a strategic objective, things that are that large scale where a cascading failure would be particularly problematic. Again, looking at things like air traffic control. If something goes wrong with that, I would call that a strategic failure right there.
So within Strat, you move on to the next step. Once you've identified and chosen that system, you want to start to plot the different threats that are out there. And we normally do this in cyber with probability and impact and understanding where threats lie there. You don't want to get too lost in the weeds. You aren't really concerned about the stuff that's not going to happen very often. But rather, as most of your eyes were probably naturally drawn, you go to the critical threats, right? The top right, where it's highly probable and it's going to have a high impact on your system when you're dissecting that threat. And that's kind of a helpful exercise here as you go through and evaluate the different threats to understand what are the threatscape and which one do we need to prioritize right now. You can't honestly do strat against the entire world and every single threat that you're facing in this moment. You kind of have to start to understand what is most critical for us to focus on. What do our stakeholders care about? What is going to be the biggest impact to our bottom line?
We did particularly break this down. The idea, you're going to have to pick a different thing again based on stakeholders and based on the system. So, in the upper left-hand corner, we have the idea of black swan events, which are incredibly low likelihood of happening, but incredibly high risk. So things like supply chain compromise. In this case, we have a service provider compromise. Things that I've got to be honest seem to be moving into the higher probability more often than I think we'd like. And then in the lower right-hand corner, we actually have my favorite, and I didn't even put this on the slide, what I've heard as gray rhinoceros problems. So things that are very common, but will totally run you over when they happen often. So once you've identified a series of threats, and it might be 4 or 5, it might be, I've seen versions of that matrix that have 20 different threats on them, you have to pick a group to study. Again, if you wanted to do this methodology for everything and anything, you would be boiling the ocean. It takes too much time, it takes too much effort. Particularly though, we're looking for things that have high impact, but also threats that have cascading effects. System level thinking, because you're looking at second and third order effects, is particularly good at looking at things that have depth to their impact, as well as, again, the kind of typical resource and organizational concerns.
Yeah, no, you could, oh, sorry.
No, you got, yeah, no.
Oh, all right, yeah, no, you could certainly fail to pick the right group of threats. For me personally, I know global thermonuclear war would probably be the highest that we have, least resilience against, but that's going to be out of scope, out of bounds. So I'd focus in on ones that really matter. But after you've chosen a selected group of threats, you're going to proceed to map it, kind of how we were showing earlier with stocks and flows and causal loop diagrams, really getting an understanding of how interconnected these things are. You want to understand when a stimulus occurs in one part of the system, how that's going to have rippling effects throughout the other components. And there's also important things to think about, like the time that takes sometimes to see the change in one input reflected in a different part of the system. It's not always linear and it's not always easy to track, but when you have the system mapped out and you can start to look at it and play with different scenarios, you really have a better understanding of what you're dealing with and what you're working with.
And two things I would say, this is probably the part of this methodology you're going to spend the most time in. But I think it's incredibly valuable because this is also the place you're most likely to find things that you didn't expect. We have an example coming up, and it was a very typical scenario that I would have thought, I understand this really well, I could totally guess what this looks like. But as I'm building the causal loop diagram, I'm looking through it and going, actually, those two things are connected. Those two things do connect this way, and that one actually is kind of really a proxy for this other particular piece. And this is where you start to get, Jeannie again really touched on the idea of emergence. And while she was really focused on the idea of emergence of threats, this is where you start to see the emergence of analytics, and where you start to get to conclusions that you wouldn't have initially gotten to. And I'll be really upfront. When I did this for the air traffic control system, and maybe this is just the schadenfreude of being a cyber person, I thought, I'm going to go through this and I'm going to find a bunch of places where the air traffic control system has all kinds of problems and we're going to have to make a bunch of suggestions. And I was wrong. So for all of you flying home, feel really good. The air traffic control system's great. Your plane will probably not fall out of the sky. And if it does, that's a different system. I didn't work on that one.
Finally, you want to identify the resilience components that are already inherent to the system. As you're mapping this out, you are going to discover a lot of things that you didn't fully understand or weren't accounting for initially. And as you punch in on those, you want to look for the 4 Rs, the resistance components, the recovery components, what resurgence plans are in place for this affected system, and how at the end of the day you're going to maintain that core function of the system. So breaking it down helps give you a baseline for where the system is at in its current state.
And once you have the full understanding that you got from your previous step, this is where you can come through and you can take all those different resilience pieces and try to apply them at each of the different levels. So you can sit there and say, okay, is adaptability going to help us with resistance, or should we focus on improving adaptability when it comes to retention? Should we be looking at, is decentralization going to help us with resistance, but maybe make recovery a little bit harder? This isn't a set in stone, one right answer or the other. You kind of have to take the time and use your new understanding of the system to figure out how to apply these different strategies in different ways. It's going to be organization dependent. It's going to be threat dependent. And the other thing I try to keep in mind for this one in particular is, we generally score these from 1 to 5. They don't all have to be 5s by the end. Like, it's okay to have a system that has really high resistance and really high retention, but we're not going to make as much of an investment in resurgence right now because we feel like that's either pretty well handled or just not a major priority. But it lets you kind of frame these things when you're going to stakeholders to say, here's the impact we expect to have. Here's why we're going to invest in this new incident response tool, or here's why we need to go get this access to a new cyber threat intelligence platform or a new feed. It's going to improve our resistance. It's going to help us when we're in recovery, assist the incident response team better. So from there, you assess these. As I said, we have the scoring system. You'll typically build metrics across each of the different Rs of resilience. These can also tie into metrics you may already be keeping as an organization. So time to detect, loiter time. When you're going into other things like retention, you can go into probably a different set of metrics that I'd imagine most of us aren't focused on in terms of how often are critical functions maintained, how quickly are we recovering from a disruption. And I put this out here. I understand this isn't a particularly cyber threat approach on its own, but this is where we can start having better input to our architecture teams, our GRC teams, other organizations to help them help us. And then after this, you're going to take your time and use this whole built-up group of knowledge to start making recommendations that improve those different resilience goals. So what's this look like in our world? So a quick case study. Chandler was the one who particularly was interested in MOVEit. I don't remember exactly why you liked that so much, but
it's the first one that came to mind. It was like a pop quiz. But yeah, jumping at MOVEit, I'll do the speedy review of MOVEit and apply STRAT methodology to it. And Professor Roberts will probably correct and grade my criteria here because it's about getting through it. But MOVEit's super simple to understand. The ransomware, we're going to study how it affects just a generic company's infrastructure, and they just use MOVEit for their file transfer software. So we're going to study this system here. And starting, right, we're going to scatter plot the different threats that could affect our system with MOVEit. You've got everything from obviously just ransomwaring the entire system to maybe an insider threat. Somebody's using MOVEit to try and pull secure files and move files that they should not have access to out of the company, data leaks, other things like that.
And if we weren't clear off the bat, this is where cyber intelligence fits in. This is the place where the kind of work we do should be moving into this particular process, where it's the cyber threat intelligence team that's going to do things like determine, okay, is MOVEit really going to likely be used to deploy ransomware, or is it going to be used to deploy an insider threat, using MOVEit? This is where we fit into the process in particular, as well as starting to make recommendations later on.
All right, now that you've gotten to that point, you're going to start examining those threats and then pick one of them that you want to use and focus on the system. This one, we decided to punch in on that critical top vulnerability, high likelihood of probability, high impact. and that is the ransomware that is deployed through MoveIt. Looking at the vulnerabilities, we understand how it affects the system, how it's going to be able to exploit the inherent weaknesses within the system, and you start to understand the impact at a larger scale of a ransomware case like this, like we saw with many companies. This is a beautiful, albeit not fully complete, system diagram of what this might look like for your company. If you just started down at that southern point, you look at the first transfer vulnerability and you understand how it starts to propagate up to the system as we study its impact. It's going to lead to more ransomware deployment. It's going to start propagating, continue to compromise more endpoints. More data is going to be leaked. As data is going out, our reputation is going to be damaged. That's going to be hurting the bottom line. It's also going to be increasing our need to respond to this. Incident response, the intelligence cycle, all the different components that we're modeling here through recovery and resilience and resurgence. It's super important to understand that one key point has large scale effect.
And so a great example of a balancing loop, for example, is we see incident response effectiveness. The less incident response effectiveness we have, the more likely we're going to see system downtime. We're going to have more time when our systems aren't running. Well, the more time they're not running, the more we're going to have to work towards getting to recovery. And by the same token, the more time spent in recovery is going to directly impact how efficient our incident response is. If you're just doing nothing but firefighting, running from one incident to another, that's going to degrade your incident response team's ability to continue to respond.
All right. Once you're at that point, you want to identify the inherent resilience in the system, break it down, understand what you're working with. In the case of examining movement ransomware, sure, this generic company probably had some good network security in place. They probably had some backups. Everyone has backups. Whether they're untested or not, we don't know. We're not going to say. But they probably were prepared to hopefully come back.
They weren't tested.
Yeah, they weren't.
It's fine.
It's all right. And of course, they were prepared to do their incident response plans, everything that goes into good security hygiene. Well, as we dig further into it, we understand that they really were not doing too hot. You look at their retention, it's like, yeah, they had the backups there, but I mean, MoveIt also had access to the same backups. So your backups might have gotten ransomware through this vulnerability. You're looking at their recovery, there was no recovery plan. They were dead in water when this hit, and they were just one of the companies that threw their hands up in the air and didn't know what to do. Resistance was poor, resurgence was poor. So this is how you start to quantify and put numbers to the metrics that you're looking at here with your system and understand really where are we at and how this threat is able to impact us.
And I thought this was really key because when you say resilience, it's a big squishy thing. But giving some set of metrics, even if they're not, what's the difference between 2 and 3 when it comes to this? That's a messy thing. But it does allow you to start showing a directionality and at least a relative movement in the organization towards being more resilient.
And then finally, they come away from this and they provide recommendations. At the end of the day, no director board, no C-suite wants you to walk in there and just say, yeah, we're in trouble. We got nothing to do about it. We have no idea. No, you use this tool and use this methodology in order to come to a conclusion of this is the system, this is what we understand about the different components, and this is what we're going to do about it to try and affect the system in a way that's positive and is what we're trying to control for. So let me dump into it, yeah.
So, in closing, defense, especially cyber threat intelligence, should be more than just indicators of compromise and TTPs. There was a really fantastic article a couple years ago by John Lambert of Microsoft, and he put out the idea that attackers think in graphs, defenders think in lists, and as long as that's the case, we are always going to be behind. And we see STRAT as one of the ways we can get away from that thinking in lists, get towards the idea of thinking not even just in graphs, but in systems, and using those systems to help build resilience by improving resistance, retention, recovery, and resurgence. So I am a huge fan of structured analytic techniques of any kind because they provide a way to get to answers we might not necessarily have thought of off the top of our heads. To that end, if you'd like to know more about how structured analytic techniques can work, you should come to Rebecca and I's workshop tomorrow afternoon. And then again, I see this, this was not built as a cyber threat intelligence process, but I, as a cyber threat intelligence engineer, immediately saw this and thought, we can apply this to take those messages that frankly just end up in reports and sometimes don't turn into anything and use it to actually drive change by making better structured recommendations. So if you'd like to learn more, there's a couple different resources on systems thinking. There is a guide for how to do STRAT. If I can figure out how to do redirects from Google Docs, which I haven't figured out yet, but that will be up later today. And then if you want to find out more about the CTI program, you can find that as well. So thank you.